What if I told you there was once a king so terrified of human touch that he wrapped himself in reinforced clothing and banned people from getting too close? It's not because he was a germaphobe or had some rare skin condition, but because he genuinely believed his body was made of glass and would shatter into 1,000 pieces if anyone bumped into him. Meet Charles V, 6th of France, a man who started his reign as Charles the Beloved and ended it as Charles the Mad. This wasn't just your typical medieval monarch having a few bad days. This was a king who forgot he was king, attacked his own knights with a sword, spent decades convinced he was made of the most fragile material known to man. Charles was essentially raised by his uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon. These weren't loving father figures. They were ambitious, greedy men who saw the young king as their ticket to power and wealth. They bled the royal treasury dry, while Charles was too young to stop them. When Charles finally asserted his independence in 1388, dismissing his uncles and bringing in his own advisors, it seemed like the kingdom was turning A. When people tried to address him as Your Majesty, he looked at them with genuine confusion, as if they were speaking a foreign language. The episode lasted about 4 hours, and Charles finally came back to himself. He had no memory of what had happened. None. He looked around at his terrified, wounded men and asked why everyone looked so upset. The transformation was, he literally thought he was constructed from the same fragile material as a wine goblet. Charles started wearing specially reinforced clothing, thick padded garments that he believed would protect his glass body from impact. He had iron rods sewn into his doublets to prevent accidental breakage. The King of France was essentially walking around in medieval bubble wrap. The court had to completely reorganize around this delusion. Chairs were padded with extra cushions. Doorways were widened so Charles wouldn't accidentally bump into the king's. Behavior became absolutely surreal. He refused to let anyone touch him. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Charles wasn't alone in this bizarre belief. Some historians think it represented an extreme form of fragility, anxiety, the fear that one's social position or mental state was so precarious that any disturbance would cause complete collapse. For a king dealing with the pressures of ruling a war-torn kingdom, this metaphor might have felt literally true. What made Charles's case particularly tragic was how lucid he could be between episodes. The glass delusion was actually a recognized form of madness in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Scholars have found records of other people, mostly intellectuals and nobles, who believed they were made of glass. But Charles V, 6th was by far the most famous case, and was convinced that even the slightest contact would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Court attendants had to approach him like he was an actual piece of delicate glassware. Charles would shriek and flee if someone got too close. Genuinely into this mess steps an 11-year-old boy named Charles V, 6th. Some blamed it on excessive heat, others on bad humors, still others on divine punishment. And during one of these future episodes, Charles would develop the delusion that would define his reign and earn him his place in history as one of the most psychologically fascinating rulers who ever lived. Now comes the part that sounds too insane to be true, but medieval chroniclers swear it happened. During one of his later episodes, Charles V, 6th became convinced of something so bizarre. Modern historians suspect it might have been the first manifestation of what we now recognize as schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, possibly triggered by the stress of kingship. But here's the truly terrifying part. This wasn't a one-time breakdown. This was just the beginning. He was building something that looked like a stable, effective monarchy. Nobody could have predicted what was coming next. The 4-year-old king was in his prime, confident and ready for battle. Then something went horribly wrong. It started small. Page dozed off in the summer heat and accidentally dropped his lance. The metal clanged against another soldier's helmet. That's it. It's just a simple clang of metal on metal. But for Charles, that sound triggered something catastrophic. Witnesses described what the promising young king, who had won his people's love, was about to become one of history's most tragic figures. And it would all start with a single horrifying moment in a forest that would change everything. August 5th, 1392. A date that would split French history into before and after. Charles V, 6th was leading. Charles managed to end some of the civil unrest that had plagued his father's reign. He showed military competence and seemed to understand the complex political landscape of medieval France. His eyes rolled back, his face contorted with rage, and he began screaming that he was surrounded by traitors trying to kill him. Before anyone could react, Charles drew his sword and started attacking his own men. It's not threatening them, actually trying to kill them. He charged at his brother, the Duke of Orleans, screaming, "Kill the traitors!" The king's own knights had to physically restrain him as he swung his blade wildly at anyone. His marriage to a Sabo of Bavaria was strategically brilliant, securing important alliances. For a brief moment, it looked like France might actually have a competent ruler. But those early not exactly the resume you'd want for running a medieval superpower, right? But here's the thing. Charles wasn't supposed to be just another child king manipulated by power-hungry nobles. The kid actually had potential. He was intelligent, well-educated, and showed genuine interest in governing. When he finally took real control at age 20, you think modern politics are insane? Right. Wait until you hear about the king who turned an entire kingdom upside down because he was afraid of breaking like a wine glass. This is the story of how one man's delusion nearly destroyed France and created chaos that lasted for generations. Picture France in 1380. The country is bleeding from the 100 Years' War, peasants are revolting, and the previous king just died. People were genuinely excited. They called him Charles the Beloved, and they meant it. The early signs were promising. Years were also marked by a crucial weakness that would later prove catastrophic. Corner, the young king was energetic, decisive, and popular with his subjects. Military expedition to Brittany, riding through the forest of Lemon on what should have been a routine campaign, happened next as if the king had been possessed by demons. Within reach. For hours, Charles was completely gone. He didn't recognize his closest advisors, his brother, or even his own name. So complete that some witnesses thought they were looking at a different person entirely. Medieval physicians had no explanation. Over the next 3 decades, these episodes would return again and again, each one more bizarre than the last. That it defied all logic. He believed his body was made of glass, not metaphorically, not symbolically. He was terrified that a handshake or pat on the back would be his end. But it gets weirder. Servants moved in slow motion around him, as if one sudden movement might cause their monarch to explode like a dropped mirror. Definitely the most powerful person to ever suffer from it. The psychological theories behind glass delusion are fascinating. During his clear periods, he was perfectly aware of how absurd his glass obsession was. He'd joke about it, even express embarrassment. But when the delusion took hold, it was completely real to him. While Charles was busy avoiding human contact to protect his glass body, France was literally tearing itself apart. Isabel was ambitious, ruthless, and had her own agenda. The real chaos came from the power struggle between 2 massive factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. These weren't just political parties having policy debates, not in battle, not in some honorable duel, but straight up murdered on a Paris street. At one point literally disowned her own son, the future Charles II. The French court during Charles's episodes became something straight out of a dark comedy. Imagine trying to run a medieval kingdom when your monarch genuinely doesn't remember he's the king. He'd insist he was someone else entirely. Sometimes he claimed to be a simple peasant. Other times, he'd adopt completely fictional identities. The court developed this bizarre workaround system. During Charles's lucid periods, they'd rush him through as many official duties as possible. When he was lost in delusion, they'd forge his signature or make decisions in his name. He'd look around at the careful, terrified faces of his court and realize what had happened. It was like trying to run a government with a monarch who existed only part-time. You never knew which version of him would show up on any given day. Here's where the story gets really interesting. You know Joan of Arc, right? The peasant girl who heard voices from God and saved France. Well, she didn't just appear out of nowhere. The shame and confusion in those moments was reportedly heartbreaking. He'd apologize profusely, try to make sense of what he'd missed, and desperately attempt to resume his royal duties. But everyone knew it was temporary. The courtiers, Jean Fraser, the famous medieval chronicler, wrote that visiting the French court was like watching a play, where all the actors had court chroniclers recorded him introducing himself with made-up names, creating elaborate backstories for his imaginary life. The bureaucracy of kingship had to continue somehow. Servants developed their own coping mechanisms. They learned to play along with whatever identity Charles had adopted that day. If he thought he was a peasant, they'd bring him simple clothes and plain food. If he was convinced he was made of glass, they'd move around him like he was a priceless artifact. The entire refuses to recognize his own family and insists his name is someone else entirely. During his worst periods, Charles would look at Queen Isabel, the woman he'd been married to for over a decade, with complete bewilderment. "Who is this woman?" he'd ask his attendants, claiming he was illegitimate. Whether she was playing complex political chess or just completely out of her depth, the result was the same: chaos. Meanwhile, Charles would occasionally emerge from his delusions, look around at the carnage, and ask why everyone was fighting. And he'd retreat back into his glass fantasy while his kingdom burned. It was like having a when confronted about it. John basically shrugged and said it was necessary for the good of the realm. The breakdown of royal authority was so complete that people could openly admit to murdering the king's brother and face no consequences. Queen Isabel sighed so many times that historians still debate whose they were, essentially to rival mafias fighting for control of France. While the legitimate ruler was off in La La Land worried about shattering, the Armagnacs, led by Charles's brother, Louis of Orleans, wanted to continue the war against England and maintain royal authority. The Burgundians, under John the Fearless, preferred negotiating with the English and grabbing as much power as possible for themselves. Isabel would try to remind him of their wedding, their children, their years together. Charles would stare at her like she was speaking gibberish. The children had it even worse. Charles and Isabel had 12 kids together, but during his episodes, the king treated them like complete strangers. His own sons and daughters would approach him, and he'd back away in confusion or fear. Some of the younger children grew up barely knowing their father existed, except as both sides claimed to be acting in the king's best interests. Both sides were lying. What followed was a civil war that made the 100 Years' War look like a minor disagreement. When your king spends months at a time convinced he's a fragile ornament, someone else has to run the country. The problem? Everyone wanted to be that someone. Enter Queen Isabel of Bavaria, who went from being a strategic marriage alliance to becoming one of the most controversial figures in French history. With her husband lost in his delusions, Isabeau stepped into the power vacuum. The most powerful man in France would cower in corners, begging people to stay away so he wouldn't break. The irony is devastating. A king who should have been the strongest, most untouchable person in the realm had become convinced he was the most fragile thing imaginable. And while Charles was busy protecting his imaginary glass body, his very real kingdom was falling apart around him. But this wasn't some touching story of a devoted wife holding things together. The Armagnacs and Burgundians didn't just fight battles. They massacred each other's supporters, burned towns, and committed atrocities that shocked even medieval standards. Paris became a battlefield where noble families were butchered in their homes. The most insane part, all of this was happening while England was still actively trying to conquer France. So you had the English attacking from the north, the Armagnacs and Burgundians slaughtering each other in the interior, the king hiding in his palace, afraid to touch anyone because he might break. John, the fearless lad, Louis of Orleans, the king's brother, assassinated in 1407, team she was really on. She made deals with the English, betrayed French nobles, fire department run by someone who was afraid of water. Why is she in my chambers? This strange, frightening man who lived in the palace and occasionally screamed at shadows. But here's where it gets truly surreal. Charles didn't just forget he was king. Royal decrees still needed to be signed. Diplomatic meetings still had to happen, and the kingdom still required some semblance of leadership. Forgotten their lines? Foreign ambassadors would arrive expecting to meet the King of France and instead find themselves trying to negotiate with a man who insisted he was a blacksmith from Normandy. Royal household became improvisational actors in the king's ongoing mental theater. Sometimes the episodes would end abruptly and Charles would suddenly snap back to reality. Nobles, the servants, they all lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when their king would disappear again into his fractured mind. She emerged from the absolute chaos created by Charles V's sixth's madness. By 1429, France was in complete meltdown. Charles VI was still alive, but completely useless, lost in his delusions. When your legitimate king thinks he's made of glass and your heir is cowering in exile, a teenager claiming divine visions starts to look reasonable. Joan's success wasn't just about military tactics or divine intervention. The coronation at Reims Cathedral in 1429 was as much about overcoming Charles VI's legacy of madness as it was about defeating the English. Imagine trying to restore royal authority while the current king is literally hiding in corners, afraid of breaking. Joan's tragedy becomes even more poignant when you realize she was trying to save a monarchy that had been functionally broken for over 30 years. She believed in the divine right of kings at exactly the moment when the reigning king had proven that divine right meant nothing if the person wearing the crown was completely insane. Joan essentially had to rebuild royal legitimacy from scratch. The timing is crucial. The numbers tell the story of his reign's devastation. When Charles V took the throne in 1380, France was a European superpower. When he died in 1422, the English controlled Paris and most of northern France. How the mighty could fall, not through external conquest, but through internal collapse. Perhaps most tragically, Charles V's story became a reminder of human fragility. The Glass King's reign proved that sometimes the greatest threats to a kingdom don't come from foreign armies or natural disasters. Sometimes they come from the gradual shattering of a single human mind. And when that mind happens to wear a crown, the consequences can echo through history for centuries. Charles VI's story is the ultimate reminder that power means nothing if you lose your mind. All the armies, all the wealth, all the divine right in the world couldn't protect him from the chaos. Here was a man who had everything: absolute power, unlimited wealth, the love of his people, and lost it all to the chemical misfiring of his own brain. But here's what makes this story fascinating rather than just tragic. Charles VI's madness created the exact conditions that allowed figures like Joan of Arc to emerge. His weakness made room for new kinds of strength. His delusions cleared the path for someone else's visions. If this glimpse into medieval madness has left you wanting more bizarre historical, in a world where mental illness was seen as divine punishment or demonic possession, history is full of characters who make modern politics look absolutely sane by comparison. Charles's fate seemed to prove that even kings weren't protected from the most arbitrary forms. The medical fascination persisted, too. Charles VI became the most famous historical case study of what we now call severe mental illness in a position of ultimate authority. Psychiatrists still study his case as an example of the population had been decimated by war, famine, and civil conflict. The royal treasury was empty. The nobility was fractured beyond repair. One man's madness had contributed to the near collapse of an entire civilization. She showed how individual conviction could rebuild it. But both stories prove the same terrifying point. Medieval political theorists started questioning whether it was safe to concentrate so much power in a single person, especially when that person's mental state was so unpredictable. The Glass King's reign inadvertently helped lay the groundwork for more distributed forms of government. But the cultural impact was even more lasting. The image of the Glass King, a ruler so fragile he was afraid of human touch, became of the man who had once been called Charles the Beloved, was now universally known as Charles the Mad or Charles the Foolish. His death was almost anticlimactic. No dramatic final episode, no deathbed recognition scene, simply faded away, leaving behind a kingdom that had learned to function without him. The immediate aftermath revealed just how irrelevant Charles had become. His death barely registered as a political event. The real power players, the English and medieval monarchy, everything depended on the mental state of one person. That person could be either a glass-obsessed madman or a divinely inspired teenager. The Glass King had become a ghost long before he actually died. But here's where the story gets its final twist of irony. In his last lucid moments, Charles V did something that would have seemed impossible during his worst episodes. He officially recognized Charles III as his legitimate heir. After years of Queen Isabas's machinations and disputed succession, the Mad King's system was only as stable as the mind sitting on the throne. After 42 years on the throne, and Charles VI didn't die until 1422, which means Joan's entire campaign happened while the Glass King was still alive. Still occasionally, she filled a leadership vacuum that had existed for decades. While Charles VI was afraid to touch his son, the Dolphin Charles, future Charles II, was hiding in the south, too weak and demoralized to fight the English, who now controlled most of northern France. She became the royal authority that neither actual royal could provide. The psychological impact was enormous. French soldiers who had been demoralized by years of defeats and chaos suddenly had someone who believed victory was not just possible, but inevitable. Joan's confidence was infectious in a way that neither Charles's madness nor his son's hesitation could ever be. But here's the kingdom was so fractured that many people genuinely believed France was finished as an independent nation. Enter a 17-year-old farm girl who claimed the archangel. Michael had personally given her a mission to crown the Dauphin and kick the English out of France. Under normal circumstances, this would have been laughable. But these weren't normal circumstances. People in Charles II was afraid to claim his throne. Joan was fearless, decisive, and absolutely convinced of her mission. Truly tragic irony. Joan succeeded in getting Charles II crowned, but she had to work around his grandfather's insanity to do it. Emerging from his delusions to ask why everyone was fighting. In a way, Joan of Arc's story is the flip side of Charles V's, where he showed how individual madness could destroy a kingdom. Over 30 years of intermittent madness, Charles V finally died. Occupiers, the Burgundian faction, and his son Charles III had been operating as if he was already dead for years. Final coherent act was to try to restore some stability to the monarchy he had helped destroy. Charles's legacy became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute monarchy. Powerful metaphor for the brittleness of power itself. Writers and philosophers for centuries afterward used Charles V as a symbol of how quickly strength could become weakness, how psychosis can manifest in people under extreme stress and responsibility, of suffering, inside his own head. While he was busy protecting his imaginary glass body, his very real kingdom cracked and nearly shattered around him. Stories, hit that like button and let me know what other wild tales from the past you'd like to explore.